Yes, ma'am, in the back. Can you talk louder?
Yes, my name is Taylor. I'm a first-year graduate student at UAMS in the biochemistry department. My question is for Dr. History. What do you think about the method of metaprobiomics in conjunction with genomics to look at functions back to the microbiome?
Well, so what is the question? I'm sorry, what is the metaproteomics, is what you're asking?
Yes, it's study of the proteome in environmental samples such as the gut
Right.
microbiome.
Right. I actually had a PhD student working for a company that makes yogurt, and he was interested in doing metaproteomics. This is about 4 or 5 years ago. There were 8 strains they used to start the yogurt, and they wanted to know which proteins were expressed from which strain. And he worked with the group in Switzerland, and we actually managed to do it. So some interesting things. I think that's definitely the way to go. I think you need proteins. You also, of course, need RNA, the transcriptomics. And you need all together, and also, of course, metabolism. And for those of you in the audience, first-year biochemistry students, you know this, but the rest of the audience, there's something called systems biology. So my degree is in molecular biology, which is kind of physics meets biology, very reductionist. You know, can we explain things at a biochemical level, molecules and reducing everything? And you can, in a sense, kind of reduce things, but then can you put it back together? And systems biology is where you try then and be able to explain how the whole thing fits back together. And that involves both looking at the DNA sequences and the RNA and the proteins. And absolutely, I think metaproteomics is potentially very powerful. And also, a lot of times, getting back to what Dr. Fry was saying earlier, sometimes the name's not as important as what they do. And one of the things that we found is sometimes you have certain types of functions that you see, and it doesn't really matter which bacteria is doing it, you know, but you need this particular thing, and the other bacteria needs to. So one bacteria produces something, and the other eats it or something. And so, yes. Yeah.
Well, and just to sort of add to that, so I work at the Cancer Institute at UAMS, and my job is to look at how we operate in our infrastructure, and then look at other cancer centers, basically. And I mean, it's pretty much understood that in terms of moving forward with research, you're going to have genomics, you're going to have proteomics, you're going to have bioinformatics. Because whether you're talking about the microbiome or cancer or whatever, you know, we have access to that information, but we're going to have all of those pieces in order to get to a full picture. So, in the very back, yes.
My question is, what have studies shown about the effects of any type of exercise on the health of bacteria in the gut?
So that was a good question on what are the effects of exercise on the microbiome, gut microbiome.
And actually, the dean of the medical school, Pope Mosley, is very interested in this. He's very interested in studying exercise, and you know, he's really into, and he's been studying a group of men that have been exercising over time, and he has another set of men that are fit but not exercising, and certainly there is an effect, absolutely. It's one of those kind of complicated questions, so, you know, chicken and egg type things. Is it the exercise that's affecting the mind? Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. I think absolutely. I can certainly recommend exercise. And then, so having lived in Europe 21 years and coming back here, Arkansas is, you know, is one of the largest states in terms of obesity. I mean, I grew up here, so it's fair enough. But there, and this part of it is the diet, but also part of it is, you know, and you drive everywhere, and there's just, you know, people sit and they don't get the exercise. So I absolutely think that's, and just, okay, from my own personal experience, I know when I was running a lot, you know, I could definitely tell a big difference in my own personal microbiome. Yeah, I think it makes sense.
You mean your gut was smaller when you were running?
Absolutely, it was. It was a lot.
So she said, you mean your gut was smaller when you were running? Is that what you were talking about?
I won't go into more detail.
Yes. Sorry, I've been waiting a bit.
I know it's hard. We got a lot of hands. I apologize to everybody. I'm trying.
With your study on the mouse, is there certain types of oncogenes you're looking at, or a specific type of signal transduction pathway, like the certain parts of it?
Not yet. We have different models.
Repeat the question,
sorry.
please.
If I'm looking at a particular oncogene or signaling transductional pathways, the differences in the microbiome influences. We're currently not doing those studies yet, just because we're just at the front of those studies. My background and my interest is the endothelial cells or the vasculature of the tumor itself. So we are focusing on signaling transduction in terms of which adhesion molecules are involved for the leukocytes to extravasate into the cancer. So receptors related or signaling pathways related to that would be tyrosine kinase receptors and signaling pathways. In terms of oncogenes, that would be actually looking at the tumor cells themselves. That's not really where our strength lays, because our strength is the vasculature or the stroma. However, we are starting up to make sure whether or not that is involved. We're starting up new, what they call spontaneous tumor models, to figure out how we can manipulate that. So not only looking at the speed or the development of the tumor, but also where actually the location of the tumor starts, and in time as well. And we also started to do some initial studies looking at metastases, or where when the tumor starts to spread, where they actually end up spreading to, and whether or not the microbiome or changes in the microbiome are influencing that as well. And our early studies is showing that indeed, that if you have a perturbed microbiome, you will have more metastases, and they will localize somewhere else.
Yes, ma'am.
Research that's supported by the Michael J. Fox Foundation has shown that Parkinson's disease patients have an altered gut biome. So where is that research going as far as treatment, and how much can you change the gut biome to see, to make a change in that condition?
It's really interesting too, because
Repeat the question.
research by the Michael J. Fox Foundation has shown that Parkinson's disease is related to changes in the microbiome. Is that pretty accurate? And so, it's really extremely fascinating research, and there's a lot of groups that are trying to do this, not only figure out what those changes are, on a consistent basis, but what types of things and how you can alter the microbiome to improve symptoms. So it's interesting because the microbiome actually can modulate many of what we call the catecholamines, including dopamine, which is very integral to Parkinson's disease. But there's other connections. Also Parkinson's disease seems to actually have a mitochondrial component, that is the powerhouse of the cell. It's found that if part of the mitochondria called the complex 1 is disrupted, it seems to be involved in Parkinson's disease. It's another model of Parkinson's. And we're also finding out that some of the works that we do at my laboratory is we're actually exposing cells to different microbiome metabolites and modulators. So the microbiome itself secretes certain modulators, which then can change or signal the physiology changes in the cell and in the body. And some of them can be energy metabolism also. There's many different ways that the microbiome may be involved to actually modulate disease. Probably it's not the microbiome itself. Of course, it's probably an interaction of some predisposing factor plus some type of trigger from some type of dysfunction or dysbiosis in the microbiome, causing neurons to not work and degenerate. So really fascinating connections. How we fix that, I think, is something that is a very active area of research, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to see how we can, not only fix the microbiome to improve symptoms, but maybe figure out what those triggers are, what those risk factors are, so we can prevent those triggers and the dysbiosis from occurring in the first place.
Can I just add a little
Yeah,
bit to this?
please do.
So every Tuesday afternoon, Intuan and I were part of this meeting with Dr. Linda Larson Pryor. She's a professor at UAMS, and
She was one of our speakers
Oh,
at
Erin! Yes, of course. Never mind. So she spoke before.
She was in last
About
month when we
neurology.
were talking about memory. She was one of our
And
panelists.
so we're working on the microbiome and Parkinson's disease. We're going to talk about quite a bit. And an observation, these guys, Aaron probably knows more about than me, but just an observation here, that many people with Parkinson's disease are constipated. Is this true, Aaron?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That is a problem.
And so...
Also hyposmia, losing the sense of smell, so
Yeah.
there's the
So
vector.
there's a lot of fairly straightforward explanations. Of course, the microbiome is different, constipation versus not. Now, giving a laxative, is that going to fix it? Well, I don't think so. It's a lot more complicated, right? But there is that observation. So sometimes there are some kind of, yes, you see this, but it's a cause and effect. There's a lot of other things that are going on. So just wanted to add that. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of PPI use, and we know it affects Helicobacter. And that's one thing you can kind of more or less change and see its effect on the microbiome. With 50 million people taking proton pump inhibitors, has that been studied to see what happens downstream?
You know, and the thing is, you're going to take this for the rest of your life, right? This is great for the pharmaceutical companies. You have to keep taking this. And it's affecting the pH of your stomach. And,
Will you break the...
oh, the question is, do proton pump inhibitors, these antacids, it's not really antacids, but it's heartburn remedy, right? And again, so from my own experience, I was taking these for a while, these proton pump inhibitors. And then when I started running, a friend of mine said that basically running now, because I had, this, where the top of the stomach isn't closing properly, right? Whatever this is called. And she said that when she started running, this disappeared. And sure enough for me, the same thing. That basically, as I ran, then I no longer needed to take them. And then I haven't taken them since then. But you got to wonder if you're changing the pH. Probably your stomach has a really strong acid for a reason. And if you're altering...
We know it changes Helicobacter.
And Helicobacter pylori, which is kind of fun, is one of the few bacteria that's rated as a class 1 carcinogen. This bacteria can cause cancer. It lives in the gut of many people, and in the stomach. And Barry Marshall and others got the Nobel Prize for actually showing that this bacteria can live in your gut. Because a lot of people in your stomach, they said stomach's sterile because nothing can grow in pH 2. Well, it turns out Helicobacter pylori can. And also people used to think that urine was sterile. No, it's not. And a lot of things that we thought turns out. And there's the microbiome of the hair. I mean, there's everything has bacteria and everything's growing in it. Just for the record.
So I have a quick question. Is there a microbiome of the brain?
This is an interesting thing because presumably bacteria can't cross the blood-brain barrier in principle, right?
In principle, you're absolutely right. The brain is thought to be sterile, but we know in many infectious disease that actually viruses and other organisms hide in the brain, and they may be there for a very long period of time. So it may be that we find that it isn't so sterile to begin with. Yeah, and so that was the amazing thing. I think when they found amniotic fluid, has its own microbiome, because everybody thought, of course, the baby is sterile, but these are notions that have been thought of for a long time, which are being broken now.
And there's a study which came out this week actually showing the interaction on the vasculature of the brain, influencing it from that particular way. So, of course, I would include the vasculature of the brain as part of the brain as well, but you might argue on that. And there again, that relates back to what they call in the immunological field toll-like receptors, the innate response, and there seems to be a crosstalk that seems to be essential.
Yes, sir.
What's the connection between the microbiome and pandas?
Oh, so what's the connection between the microbiome and PANDAS? And PANDAS stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder Associated with Strep.
I thought it was Panda Bear. Eating shoots and leaves.
So it's interesting. So what I would say is it's not clear. I don't think there's any good studies on it, but it's definitely the idea that PANDAS or PANS, is something that's autoimmune. There's definitely studies that suggest that the immune system is involved in PANDAS, and like symptoms in PANDAS includes these neuropsychiatric symptoms, mostly include things like tics, repetitive behaviors, obsessive compulsive type behavior. And there's research that suggests those symptoms may be very well mediated by the immune system. There's a paper just came out on Tourette's syndrome showing that there's activation of the immune system. And there's a lot of literature suggesting that many neuropsychiatric disorders may involve dysfunction of the immune system. So, and there's some good literature suggesting that there is an immune effect that's causing PANDAS. Although I think that the studies are still preliminary, that's definitely where the money seems to be in PANDAS. And the fact that the gut microbiome can disrupt the immune system, I think it's really a very good possibility that it has a role in many of these neuropsychiatric diseases we see that are associated with autoimmune conditions or activation of the immune system. And it's not and it's things that have been observed, and there's a lot of psychiatric diseases where the GI symptoms have been observed, but they've kind of been dismissed for many years because people just didn't understand how they went together. And one of the reasons is that when we look at a lot of psychiatric diseases, there are a kind of a bunch of symptoms, and there's probably many different causes for the same symptoms. And one of them is probably some type of autoimmune dysregulation that causes it in some people. So in some people they probably have these symptoms, and other people they don't have those symptoms. And it's until we understand these connections that we're going to be able to kind of piece these all out together instead of just describing them as a phenomenon. Rather than actually looking at the biology. Does that answer your question?
Best as you can. Best as probably could be answered.
Yes, sir.
Being a nutritionist, I have to ask a dietitian. I see patients and I wonder if changing their microbiome through food, I understand that it takes a fair amount and daily because the microbiome you have is pretty well established and it has to compete with that. And so you have to constantly take it. And my first question would be, how much do you need to take a day to keep that good bacteria flowing there with the other? And if they happen to get sick with a cold, is that the time to really dose up on kefir and sauerkraut and yogurt and stuff to take advantage of the fact that the other is wiped away, kind of like you do with a fecal transplant, you give the antibiotics first.
Yeah, sure. So when I was on the radio, someone asked me about this as well, a similar type of question, and I talked about this. So Dorothy's a microbiologist. I'm very proud of it, and I also kind of my background's microbiology, and we used to have these microbiology breakfasts they're called chalk talks. You're not allowed to do any formal presentations. All you have is a blackboard, and then every week a different microbiologist would talk. And one week we came in, and this microbiology they're looking at from a nutrition point of view, and they have this stuff up there. They've got some bread and some apples and bananas and some different types of fruit. And she holds up the bread, or actually, in this case, a potato, I guess, and says, all right, if you were to eat a French fry, by the time the French fry gets into your stomach, there's nothing left. Because it's mainly starch, and the amylase, the proteins, can degrade down, and sugar, it's gone, all right? And it turns out that a lot of obese people, I live in Arkansas now. A lot of obese people, the gut bacteria are actually starving because nothing makes it down there. All right? And so if you're to eat something like an apple or something that's more difficult, like lettuce or something that's more difficult, the roughage, that gets down there and that feeds the bacteria in your intestine. And so your question about, altering the diet, well, in fact, for many people, sadly, many people in Arkansas, their gut bacteria even though they're overweight, the bacteria is starving. Help, help. And so eating really good roughage will help tremendously. You can do your bacteria a favor. So that's just a thought. I can't remember the second question. I can only remember one thing at a time.
Take antibiotics. Should you load up on? Well, there is a certain amount, and I read there's a certain amount. That's why you should take a lot of probiotics, because there is a certain amount that can get through. And so if you eat yogurt several times a day, maybe, or... This brings
up, people earlier, I think you'd asked about probiotics. And I actually work with a guy that's for this company that sells bacteria to people. And he's on this committee that decides what the definition of probiotic is. And it turns out, in the definition, by definition, a probiotic is a supplement that you take. It's harmless, it doesn't hurt you. It has some health benefits, but it doesn't stay in your system. That's the definition. And so, they transiently are there, but that's fantastic from the point of view of this company that wants to sell you things, right? Because you have to take it every day. But in terms of actually getting a good flora, you want something that's stable, and you want to be able to figure out. That's why, again, I say rather than take, of course, probiotics are helpful. And I admit, I go to Kroger, I use their kind of generic, with lots of diversity, fine, I don't know. But maybe I'm wasting money. But I also, every morning I eat an apple, and I try and eat more roughage. I figure that helps.
Enteric-coated supplements.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're going to go back to fecal transplants now. Where do you get a healthy donor?
Yeah, I mean,
Where do you find one
there's a whole industry that's developing on that.
So the question's on fecal transplants. Where do you find a healthy donor? How do you identify a healthy donor?
Sorry, I forgot.
That's okay. It's a long night. It kind of trails at the end usually.
And so we can use the more modern name, microbiota transfer therapy.
Okay.
And there's also synthetic microbiomes as well, so we know what's good. And so we have now a little more sterile, so we have these types of bacteria that you can give.
Yeah, so there's things like the RoboGut and other types of ways that people actually are growing bacteria and then actually making bacteria which can be transplanted. And then there's other ways of people companies that actually test people's microbiome and find out who are good donors, and actually identifying those good donors and paying them to give them a donation on a regular basis. And so this is a whole industry. Now, of course, there's all these questions of what is a good donor, what does a good microbiome look like? And I think a lot of that is somewhat taking a stab in the dark at this point, but I think there's some good guidelines.
Yeah, I think there's companies you can basically pay them $100, isn't it? Is this right into what? $100. You give them a little sample of your shit, and give them $100, and then they tell you what your composition is. There you go.
Yes.
Following up on that, what types of problems have these transplants really affected in a good way that we really know?
I guess the one that's really set in stone is C. difficile, so infection.
That's the only one for sure?
Well, I think that's the one that we have the very, very strong data on.
It works, right?
It works. So that's what we have the data on of. This actually works. Now there's research into other GI disorders, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, where people are looking at it a lot closer. To see if but those are preliminary. There's certain types of, neurologic disorders. Multiple sclerosis is a big area, right? So with germ-free mice, the animal model of multiple sclerosis, the animal does not develop multiple sclerosis in a germ-free environment. So we know that the microbiota is very important in triggering the immune process that starts multiple sclerosis. We suspect that. I don't say that we're sure about that, but we suspect that. So that's another hot area. Parkinson's disease, these other areas, cancer. These are all areas of active research. But I think the only one now that you can definitely say that we have data that says, oh, this works, is in C. diff infections.
Yeah, and I've heard, this might be urban legend, you've probably heard this story as well, that when they're trying they got NIH clinical trials, and they're giving some people, the transplant, and some people got a placebo or whatever, and they actually had to stop it because everyone they gave the transplant to worked, and the other people didn't. So it was very effective. I mean, it worked really well.
Which is very profound. You don't usually get a research study that's that beautiful in terms of the results. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
This is more of a personal question, but as a child, age 4, I was diagnosed with cancer and had 15 months of chemo. Starting about age 14, it was just one health condition after another. IBS, fibromyalgia, arthritis, insulin resistance, and just kept going. I'm 35 right now. The only thing that has brought me relief is the Plexus probiotic that I take, and it's kind of restored balance. But I've always wondered, is there a direct correlation between all of the treatments that I had for such a long time that it disrupted my microbiome enough to kind of set up a failure from the get-go?
So the question was, an individual who had cancer as a child, went through chemo, about 10 years later started having all sorts of autoimmune, or all sorts of issues, many of which are associated with autoimmune conditions, and has gotten relief from a Plexus probiotic. So
Well, is there a direct correlation between like the treatments at that age for such a long time and all of these health?
So I think there could be, it may not be in the microbiome specifically, but many of those treatments could skew the immune system one way or the other. And so it could be that the immune system itself is dysregulated by some of those treatments, and the microbiota, the probiotic is helping your microbiome actually regulate the immune system. Or it could be that your microbiome was disturbed also. I don't think we know specifically in your case, but that is a possibility. And it's one of those things, I guess, if it works for you, that's wonderful.
yeah.
Beer has wheat and grain and so forth in it. People drink a lot of beer, and that affects you one way. Some people drink wine, and that's grapes. That may affect a different thing. And then some people drink pure grain alcohol or whiskey. What's the effect of alcohol on the system, like that we're talking about?
It's a question for the Danes, I think. As well. The Dutch drink quite a bit of.
So the question is, what's the effect of alcohol on the microbiome?
What's the effect of alcohol on the microbiome? Well, I think the effect of alcohol on asking questions about the microbiome. It's being demonstrated. Yeah, but.
So my thesis advisor was a microbiologist, and sometimes when he would get a cold, his theory was if he could get 70% ethanol in his bloodstream, then he'd probably kill everything.
My mentor in microbiology said the exact same thing. He had 70% alcohol everywhere.
My whole country says the same thing.
Okay, so I have one more quick question, and then we'll wrap up. If you want to talk to these folks afterward, you can do so. We have talked about bacteria quite a bit. We've talked a little bit about viruses. What about fungi? What about archaea? What about parasites? Are they part of the picture as well? Or how much do we know about them?
Absolutely. And there's lots of viruses. Like I said, for every one bacteria, there's 10 viruses. And when we start looking at people, looking at samples, we see lots of things. These mumps people, the mumps, or the mump samples, sorry, we got little swabs for their mouth, and they put them in a little tube, and now we can sequence it, and we see other viruses in there as well. So.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question of talking about other organisms like worms and other things that that live in our gut, and so there's so as we talk about it, it's a whole ecosystem, and some people refer this and say the microbiome, the macrobiome of these multicellular organisms that live in our gut. And it's one of these things. It's very interesting because a lot of, actually parents of children with autism come to me and they ask me about parasites, and I always ask them before I answer the question. They want to know my opinion, and I ask them, well, are you pro-parasite? Are you anti-parasite? Because many people think, oh, parasites are very bad to live in my gut. I should take medication. My child, if he has any parasites, or he or she, they should get rid of these parasites. And then there's a whole nother theory of that. Actually, one of the reasons that we have such a rise in autoimmune disease is because we don't have parasites in our gut. And there's a whole, arm of science that looks at this. One of the things, there's something called the hygiene hypothesis, where that the fact that we've become too hygienic, now we're not exposed to these. And because of that, our immune system, where it used to spend its time keeping these parasites in check in our gut, now it has nothing to do, so it starts to attack our body. And then there's studies where we've tried to reintroduce parasites into the gut, and it's very, it's very interesting. Some of the studies, the way they've designed. We can take some of the studies use the pig whipworm, which and they use pig whipworm ova, which you actually take like a medication. And it's very interesting because they cannot reside for a long period of time. Like, they must be a probiotic by the definition, in your gut. So you would think, well, it sounds terrible to have worms in your gut, but actually these are worms that can't live in your gut, so they're just like a drug. They hatch, they live in your gut, they cause an immune reaction, and they are eliminated. So if you have a bad reaction to them or something, they go out just like you take a medication. And there's a whole line of science that is actually looking into this idea of not enough parasites in your gut, and thinking that the parasites, the elimination of parasites because of too much hygiene, has actually destabilized the microbiome. I can't say that it's a definite, there's any definite conclusions there. I know that a lot of the trials with a lot of these organisms have been less than, there's been many clinical trials to actually look at this, and they just haven't not turned out stellar, and haven't produced the data that we would predict. So I think it's still a big open question.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Please thank our panelists, Roseanne, come back in a month. We'll talk about cyber warfare. It'll be another very cool but different discussion. And y'all be safe getting home. Come talk to these folks a little bit if you want to. And thank you all so much. Good.